1. Pip and Estella. My story begins when I was 7 years old. I was in the graveyard of the church that was very close to my home. Both of my parents were buried there. Suddenly, I started crying because I felt afraid, and the noise of my sobs filled the graveyard. "Who is making that awful noise?" said a low voice. A terrible-looking man came toward me. "Don't move or I'll cut your throat," he said. He was dirty and was wearing leg irons. He must have escaped from the local prison. He grabbed me and I cried, "Please don't kill me." "What's your name? Quickly," he demanded. "Pip," I said. "Where is your home?" he asked. I pointed to the nearby village. He then turned me upside down to empty my pockets. I only had a piece of bread, and he quickly picked it up and devoured it. "Where are your parents?" he asked. I pointed to the gravestones in the churchyard. "They are in the ground over there, sir," I replied. "So who do you live with?" "My sister, sir, wife of Joe Gargery, the blacksmith, sir," I told him. "Blacksmith, eh? You know what a file is?" "Yes, sir," I said. "Then you bring me a file and some food, and then I won't kill you," he said. I agreed, and then he let me go. Just before I left, he said again, "You bring me the file and food tonight, you hear? And don't tell anyone you saw me. If you do, I'll find you and tear your heart and liver out." I was absolutely terrified, so, once more, I promised to bring the things and to keep quiet. Then I fled from the graveyard. I thought, I have to bring him what he wants. If I don't, he might find me at home and kill me. He knows where I live. I was worried. It would not be easy to sneak the food out of the house. My sister was much older than me and often lost her temper. If she caught me, she would punish me. On the other hand, her husband Joe was always kind to me. He often protected me from my sister. That night, when I tried to hide some bread in my pocket, he said, "Pip, you are eating too fast. You couldn't have eaten all your bread so quickly. You'll get sick if you're not careful." My sister looked at me and said, "What's he been doing?" "He's eating too quickly." "I ate too quickly when I was a boy, but not as fast as you," Joe said. My sister pulled me up from the table by my hair. "Well then, it's time for a dosing." My sister made me drink a spoonful of tar water, which was a disgusting, thick, dark liquid. It was awful. I swallowed it as quickly as I could. When Joe and my sister were asleep, I crept into the kitchen and grabbed a pork pie from the pantry. Joe's uncle Pumblechook had given it to my sister for Christmas dinner, which was the next day. After that, I took some brandy and a file from Joe's workshop. I ran to the graveyard and quickly gave the pie, brandy, and file to the awful man. He was very happy. Then I ran back home. The next day came, and I was very worried. I knew my sister would discover that the pie and brandy were gone. My sister prepared dinner, and Uncle Pumblechook and another man, Mr. Wopsle, came to have dinner with us. It was a very nice dinner, and near the end, I began to think I might survive the night. Just then, my sister said, "I almost forgot. Uncle Pumblechook gave us a pie." She went to get it, but came back empty-handed. "It's gone," she said in a surprised voice. I felt so guilty that I jumped up and ran out of the room. I ran to the front door and opened it. I was very surprised. There was a group of soldiers and a policeman standing in front of the door. The policeman said, "We need Joe to fix these for us." He was holding some handcuffs. 2 prisoners escaped from the prison last night. Joe took the handcuffs and repaired them. Then we all went to join in the search for the 2 men. I sat high on Joe's shoulders as we walked through fields and forests. I hoped I would see the prisoner first. I was afraid that he would think I had told the police about him. After some more searching, we all heard shouting. We followed the noise and saw two men fighting. One was the prisoner I gave food to, and the other had a long scar on his face. The soldiers quickly caught them. As they were led away, the man I had met saw me. I shook my head. I was trying to tell him that I had kept my promise. He looked at me without anger. He turned to the policeman and said, "I stole a pork pie and some brandy from the blacksmith's." Joe said in a surprised voice, "Yes, we are missing a pork pie." Joe then said to the prisoner, "Whatever wrong thing you did, you have a right to eat." Then the soldiers took the two prisoners back to prison. In the village, I was going to an elementary school. Mr. Wopsel's great aunt taught at the school. She was very old, and she often fell asleep in class. She had a granddaughter, Biddy, and she sometimes taught in the school instead of her grandmother. She was an orphan, and even though she looked a little dirty, she was very kind to all of the students. She taught me to read and write. One cold winter evening, I sat beside Joe and wrote on a slate, "My dear Joe, I hope you are great." "Well, I hope I shall soon be able to teach you, Joe." Joe was very impressed with my note. "Pip, how smart you are," he exclaimed. He smiled at me. Joe had promised to teach me to become a blacksmith when I became older. But I didn't want this. I dreamed of a better life. I wanted to be rich and to study all day long. I sat dreaming about the life I wanted, but my happy thoughts were interrupted when my sister came into the room saying, "Well, what a lucky boy our Pip is. I hope she doesn't pamper him." Mr. Pumblechook was with my sister, and he said, "She's not the type to pamper a person." "Who?" asked Joe. "Miss Havisham," replied my sister impatiently. "She wants Pip to play with a girl in her house. She might even pay him. He'd better go or he'll be in trouble with me." Joe was very surprised. "How does she know Pip?" he asked. "Idiot," replied my sister. "She doesn't know him. Uncle Pumblechook is her neighbor. She asked if he knew a boy, and then he kindly mentioned Pip." Uncle Pumblechook looked very pleased. He was proud he knew Miss Havisham. "This boy could make money by going to Miss Havisham. He should be grateful," said my sister. I was not grateful at all. Miss Havisham was a very rich but strange and stern woman. She lived in a large, cold house, and she never went outside. I didn't want to spend any time with her or in her house, but I had no choice but to go. The next morning, my sister forced me to leave the house with Uncle Pumblechook. We walked slowly to Miss Havisham's house. We rang the bell, and a servant opened the gate. She let me in but said to Uncle Pumblechook, "She doesn't want to see you." I followed the servant through the dark, dreary house until we came to a door. The servant knocked on the door and said, "Go in." I entered and the door was slammed behind me. There were many candles in the room, and Miss Havisham was sitting in a chair. She was dressed completely in white and wore many jewels. She had a veil over her face. She was the strangest looking person I had ever seen. "Who is it?" she demanded. "I am Pip, ma'am," I said. "Pip?" "Yes, ma'am, Mr. Pumblechook's boy. I've come to play," I told her. "Come here," she said. I was extremely scared, but I walked closer. I saw her watch. It was 20 minutes to 9. Also, the clock on the wall had stopped at the same time. She said to me, "Are you afraid of a woman who has not seen the sun for many, many years?" Then she put her hand on her chest. "Do you know what is in here?" she asked me. Your heart, I said. Yes, and it's broken, she cried. Then she said, a girl named Estella lives here. I want you to play with her. Go and call her. I went to the door and called out for Estella. I waited, and then shouted out again. Finally, I saw a small figure walking along the hall. She entered the room and walked over to Miss Havisham. I want to see you play cards with this boy, she said to Estella. With him? The girl asked. Her pretty face soured with scorn. He is just a common working boy. Miss Havisham whispered something into her ear. You can make him fall in love with you and then break his heart. Estella finally sat down and dealt the cards. I picked up my cards and she looked at my hands. He has such rough hands and thick boots. He looks stupid and clumsy, she said. I had never been ashamed of myself before, but I looked at my hands and boots. My clothes were dirty and my hair was tangled. She looked down on me as though I was dirt on her shoe. We continued to play and she won. After that, I dealt the cards for a second game. She made me feel very nervous, and so I made a mistake. You are so stupid. Don't you know anything? She snapped at me. She was very unkind, but I didn't say anything back to her. Why didn't you defend yourself? Asked Miss Havisham. She says many mean things to you. What do you think of her? Whisper in my ear. I stood up and went to her. I whispered, I think she is very proud. Really? Anything else? She asked. I think she is very pretty. Estella heard me say this, and she wasn't pleased. Anything else? Miss Havisham asked again. She is very insulting, I replied, and I would like to go home. Estella took me to the front door and let me out. As she closed the door, I saw her face. She gave me a look of disgust. I felt very sad and started crying. I kicked a wall in the courtyard, and then I saw a tall, thin boy. How did you get in? He asked. Estella let me in. Come and fight me, he demanded. He took off his coat and put his fists up. I was afraid of him, but I hit him 2 times in the face, and he fell to the ground. You won, he said bravely. I didn't feel victorious. Estella had saddened my life. Chapter 2. A Change of Fortune. The next few months were mixed with pain and pleasure. Every day I went to Miss Havisham's house to play with Estella. Every day she was very mean to me. But despite her cruelty, I was captivated by her, and I wanted to see her. Also, Miss Havisham spoke to me more and more as she got used to me. One day, she asked me to push her in her wheelchair into the room next door. The room was dark and dusty, and there were cobwebs everywhere. There was a long table. On it was a wedding feast. Mice and rats were chewing on the rotten cake in the middle. However, the room did not surprise me at all, as Miss Havisham was a strange woman. One day, Miss Havisham asked me, "What do you want to do when you are older?" I replied, "I will become Joe's apprentice. I don't want to though. I want to be a gentleman and read books all day." Secretly, I thought to myself, I hope Miss Havisham helps me to become a gentleman. But she never did. She only gave me dinner for playing with Estella. She said, "I want you to bring Joe with you tomorrow. You are growing up, and it's time for you to learn your life's work." The next day, Joe came with me to Miss Havisham's house. "Is it correct that this boy is to become your apprentice?" she asked Joe. "You want to work with me, don't you, Pip?" Joe asked me. I felt very ashamed, especially when I saw Estella laughing at me. Miss Havisham said, "I want you to be Mr. Gargery's apprentice. Here is some money. Give this money to Mr. Gargery. You will be a fine blacksmith one day." With that, my visits to the house ended, and I started to learn how to be a blacksmith. I was very unhappy, however, and I worried that Estella would one day see my face covered in black and look at me in disgust again. I worked with Joe, and the time passed by quickly. 1 year later, I asked Joe if I could visit Miss Havisham. "Is that a good idea?" he replied, "because she might think you want something." "But I've never thanked her for what she did. We aren't busy these days. Can I take half a day to see Miss Havisham?" I asked. Joe said, smiling, "Her name isn't Havisham." Joe finally agreed, but then Orlick, Joe's other worker, wanted some time off too. My sister told Joe not to give Orlick any time off. My sister and Orlick were always fighting. She thought he was lazy. But Joe allowed him to take the time off anyway. I was excited to see Estella again. I washed and put on my best clothes. I happily set off for Miss Havisham's house. When I arrived, I was very disappointed. "Estella is in Europe," Miss Havisham told me. "She is getting an education. She is even more beautiful now. Everyone admires her so much." I left Miss Havisham's house feeling very depressed. I really felt I had lost Estella now. I walked home. It was very dark, and there was a heavy mist. I could hear the sound of guns in the distance. On the way, I met Orlick. He said, "Some prisoners have escaped from the prison again." I remembered the night long ago when I had met the escaped prisoner in the graveyard. As I was nearing home, a neighbor ran to me and said, "A prisoner broke into your house and someone was attacked." I ran home to find a crowd in the yard. Joe and a doctor were in the kitchen. My sister was lying on the floor. She had been hit many times on her head and back. Beside her were some leg irons. "The irons had been cut through many years before," Joe said. "They were the irons my prisoner had cut through." But I knew he hadn't attacked my sister. The attacker must have found the irons in the graveyard and then brought them into the house. Only Orlick could have done this. No one else hated my sister, but there was nothing to prove he had done it. I had a terrible feeling of guilt. I felt responsible because I provided the weapon. My sister lived, but she changed a lot. In some ways, it was good because she never yelled again or became impatient. But she never spoke again either, and was sometimes unhappy. Biddy came to live with us to help take care of my sister. She was clever and kind, but not as beautiful as Estella. I wished I could fall in love with her, but my heart belonged to Estella. My life continued as normal, with me working with Joe for the next 4 years. One day, a man named Mr. Jaggers, who was a lawyer, came to visit with some news. This changed my life forever. "Mr. Gargery, my client, wants to take this young man and raise him as a gentleman. You will be paid for your loss, of course," Mr. Jaggers said. Joe replied, "That is not necessary. If Pip has come into some good fortune, I won't stop him." I was thunderstruck. My dreams had come true. I was so happy, but I felt guilty to leave Joe, who had always been so kind to me. Mr. Jaggers continued, "There are 2 conditions for this gift. You must keep the name Pip, and your benefactor's name must be a secret. Here is some money. Buy some new clothes. You will go to London in 1 week to live with Mr. Pocket and his son Herbert." The Pockets, I thought. They are relatives of Miss Havisham. She must be my benefactor. "Here is my business card. When you arrive in London, please come to this address," Mr. Jaggers said, and then he left. Joe and I went into the house immediately to tell my sister and Biddy about my good fortune. Joe ran in first and exclaimed, "Well, the strangest things happen. God has blessed our Pip, and he is now a gentleman of fortune." The two women looked at me in amazement. "Congratulations, Pip," Biddy said, but there was a sadness in their eyes that made me angry. I thought, why can't they both be more happy for me? At dinner that night, they all kept congratulating me, but it seemed so unreal to them all, and it made me feel very strange. I couldn't understand it. I had come into such great fortune, but I felt lonelier than ever. That night, I thought of Estella. What if Miss Havisham wants me to marry Estella, I thought. This made me feel very happy. The next day, I ordered the finest clothes. They were very expensive, and I proudly showed them off to Joe and Biddy. "I will go and say goodbye to Miss Havisham," I said to them. When I arrived, I said to her, "I have just come into a great fortune, Miss Havisham. I am especially grateful for it." "Yes, I heard from Mr. Jaggers about it. You have been adopted by a rich person, I hear," Miss Havisham said. "Yes, ma'am," I replied. "And you have no idea who it is?" she asked me. "No, ma'am," I said, making sure not to say that I thought she was my benefactor. "Well then, your future looks very secure now. I wish you the best of luck, and I hope you will always keep the name Pip," she said. "Goodbye, Pip." I kneeled in front of her and kissed her hand as a way of thanking her for everything she had done for me. The day came for me to leave for London. I was very excited and very nervous at the same time. I was greatly looking forward to my life as a gentleman. I ate my breakfast very quickly, and then I kissed my sister and Biddy goodbye. I put my arms around Joe, and then I left. I walked into the village to catch the coach. If I had boarded the coach in front of Joe's old house, I would have been very embarrassed. I was filled with mixed feelings. As I left the village, tears rolled down my cheeks. "Goodbye, Joe," I thought. "Goodbye, my dearest friend." I felt terrible at the thought of leaving such a wonderful and kind man. Yet my heart was also rejoicing. My new and exciting life was just beginning. Chapter 3. A New Beginning. My journey to London was a very pleasant one. Even though the trip took 5 hours, the time went by very quickly. It was just after 12 o'clock in the afternoon when I finally arrived. The driver of the coach took me to Mr. Jaggers' office. It was not quite what I had expected. The building was rather old and gray-looking. I went into the office and asked the clerk, "I have come to see Mr. Jaggers." The clerk replied, "He is in court at the moment. Are you Mr. Pip?" "Yes, I am," I said. "We have been waiting for you to arrive. Mr. Jaggers told me to take you to your new home if you arrived while he was away," the clerk told me. He then got his coat and hat, and we left the building. He took me to a very nice little house. On the mailbox, I could see the name, Mr. Pocket, Jr. "This is it. You can just go in and wait in the living room," he said. I went up the front stairs and entered the house. I went into the living room, and not long after, I heard someone walking up the steps. A young man a little older than me entered the room. He was carrying some grocery bags. He looked at me and asked, "Are you Mr. Pip?" "Yes, I am," I replied. "Are you Mr. Herbert Pocket?" We looked into each other's faces. He looked very familiar to me. "We've met before," he told me. "You're the boy I fought and who knocked me to the ground in Miss Havisham's courtyard." I remembered now and said, "Yes, of course." We both laughed. "I heard about your good news," Herbert told me. "I still remember so clearly when we first met. Like you, I had been invited to play with Estella. But Miss Havisham didn't like me. It turned out that she liked you more. It was actually good because she's a nightmare." "Who do you mean? Miss Havisham?" I asked, confused. No, Estella. Miss Havisham taught her to hate men," he said. "Do you know the story about Miss Havisham?" "No," I replied. "I'll tell you later over dinner," Herbert promised. For the rest of the afternoon, I settled into my new room. Dinner time came, and just as he had promised, Herbert told me about Miss Havisham. Miss Havisham's father was a very rich man. He was married twice, and with his first wife, he had a daughter, Miss Havisham, and with the second wife, he had a son. The son was a terrible person, and so Mr. Havisham gave most of his money to Miss Havisham. Miss Havisham's half-brother was extremely jealous. He asked a friend to pretend to fall in love with her and ask her to marry him. She agreed and prepared everything for the wedding. However, he never showed up for the wedding. Instead, she received a letter from him saying that he would never marry her. Then I said, "That must be why all of her clocks have stopped at 20 minutes to 9. She must have received the letter at that time." "Yes, that's right," agreed Herbert. "She stopped all of the clocks just then, and never went out of the house again." "Well, do you know how Estella came to live with Miss Havisham?" I asked him. "I have no idea," he replied. Later, I went to bed and awoke to a bright new morning. The next day, Herbert's father started teaching me to become a gentleman. He was a wonderful teacher, and he gave me so many books to read. I read adventure and mystery stories, as well as essays, comedies, and even plays. We often went shopping together, and he helped me to develop a good sense of style. He taught me how to dress and how to behave at parties. Herbert was a wonderful teacher too. He taught me table manners, and he was always a great example for me to follow. I was not the only person Mr. Pocket was teaching. There were 2 other students. One student was named Startop. We became very good friends. I found him to be very warm and friendly, and we often went rowing together. The other student was named Bentley Drummel. I did not like him at all, and neither did Startop. He had a very mean personality and was very proud and lazy. One day, Mr. Jaggers invited my fellow students and me for dinner. Startup, Drummel, and I met at Jaggers' house, and Mr. Jaggers kindly took us into his dining room. Mr. Jaggers asked, "Who are these fine men with you this evening, Pip?" I introduced Startop and Drummel. I was very surprised because Mr. Jaggers seemed to like Drummel very much. We all sat down to dinner, and the first course was served by a woman who looked about 40 years old. She was very quiet and did her work very efficiently. I didn't know what it was, but something seemed very familiar about her. Each time she came in with a new course, I closely watched her. I wanted to know why she seemed so familiar to me. The dinner finally came to an end. During the dinner, Mr. Jaggers and Drummel had had a great deal of conversation. Mr. Jaggers said, "Mr. Drummel, I drink to you. You will be very successful in life." I and Startop were astounded at this. Mr. Jaggers was a very smart man, but he had been fooled by Drummel. Unfortunately, Mr. Jaggers would not be the only one. My life passed by very pleasantly in London. I learned a great deal and spent my days trying to improve myself more and more. One day, I received a letter from Biddy. It read, "Dear Mr. Pip, Mr. Gargery asked me to write to you. He plans to go to London, and he would like to see you. He will visit you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Biddy. P.S. Even though you are now a refined gentleman, please see Mr. Gargery. He is such a kind and gentle man, and so are you." Even though it was good news that Joe was coming to London, I did not want to see him. I still cared very much for him, but he did not fit into my life anymore. If I could have prevented him from coming to the house, I would have. I felt guilty because I was not kind like Biddy said I was. The next morning, I got up early to clean and get ready for Joe's visit. Later in the morning, I heard him arrive. I could hear the sound of his heavy, clumsy boots on the stairs. I met him at the front door and showed him in. "Joe, it's good to see you. How are you?" I asked him. "Pip, how are you?" he replied. Joe put his hat on the floor and took both of my hands in his and shook them for the longest time. For a moment, I didn't think that he was going to let go. "It's so good to see you, Joe. Give me your hat," I said. Joe felt very awkward in the house, and he didn't want to give me his hat. He picked his hat up off the floor and held it very tightly in his hands. "You've changed so much," he said. "You've grown into a fine young man that this country should be proud of." I felt very uncomfortable. When I introduced him to Herbert, Herbert tried to shake his hand. Joe backed away. He certainly wasn't behaving like the Joe I once knew. Joe bowed his head. "Would you like some tea or coffee, Mr. Gargery?" Herbert asked. "Thank you, sir," Joe said uncomfortably. "I will have whatever you are having." Herbert suggested, "Let's have some coffee then." Joe did not like coffee, and so he said, "Isn't coffee a bit bitter?" "Then we shall have some tea," Herbert kindly said. We all sat down to breakfast, and Herbert poured the tea. We spoke very stiffly to one another for a while, and then Herbert left for work. I felt relieved when he left, and so did Joe. "Now that we are alone, sir," Joe started. I interrupted by saying, "How can you call me sir? You are like a father to me." Joe looked at me nervously and started talking again. "Now that we are alone, I want to tell you that I have a message from Miss Havisham." "From Miss Havisham?" I asked in surprise. "Yes, Estella is home and will be happy if you visit." I felt my face burn. If I had known Joe had this message for me, I would have been kinder to him. Joe now stood up and prepared to leave. "You are doing well, Pip, and I wish you nothing but the best. I hope you prosper here in London." "Where are you going now? Aren't you going to return for dinner?" I asked him. "Pip, I should return home. We live different lives now. You are very comfortable living this life, but it doesn't suit me. I belong in the country as a blacksmith. I feel very awkward here in London. God bless you, Pip." Joe put his hat on, said goodbye, and left. Chapter 4. Some Terrible News. The next day, I caught a coach for my hometown. I felt very guilty about Joe's visit. I had not treated him like I should have. I knew that when I went to visit Miss Havisham, I should go and stay with Joe to make up for his terrible time in London. But I also knew that Joe would feel awkward. He would be worried that his dirty old house would not be good enough for me anymore. I decided to stay at the Blue Boar Inn in the village instead. I knew that I should visit Joe first. However, I went to Miss Havisham's house. She adopted Estella, and I am sure she has been helping me too. She must like me and want me to marry Estella, I thought. I felt better every time I thought of Estella. I arrived at the house and rang the doorbell. I was very surprised because a new employee answered the door. It was Orlick. Joe must have fired him. Orlick looked at me with scorn and said, "There are changes everywhere in the world." I ignored him and entered the house. Miss Havisham was sitting quietly in a chair in the banquet room, and standing beside the fire was a woman I had never seen before. "Miss Havisham, I heard that you wished to see me, so I came as soon as I could." On hearing my voice, the woman by the fire turned around. It was Estella. She had grown up and become incredibly beautiful. I felt as if I had not changed at all. I was still the same country boy. Estella looked at me and Miss Havisham asked her, Has he changed, Estella? Yes, he has changed very much. Then Estella left the room. Miss Havisham said, "She is graceful and beautiful, isn't she?" Her next words frightened me very much. She took my hand and pulled me close to her. In my ear she whispered, "Love her, love her, love her. If she loves you, love her. If she rejects you, love her. And if she breaks your heart, love her." I was so surprised that I didn't know how to reply. "Pip, I adopted her to be loved. I raised her to be loved. I want you to love her, love her." Miss Havisham seemed like she had gone crazy. She pointed to the door. "Go to her, Pip." She went into the garden. "Go and talk to her. Walk with her," she ordered me. I left Miss Havisham and went to find Estella. She was standing in the garden with her back to me. I awkwardly spoke to her. She was like a fine lady in the way she walked and talked, and I felt like a little boy beside her, instead of the true gentleman I wanted to be. She showed no interest in me. I certainly knew that she had not thought of me like I did of her. We walked a little further through the garden, and she suddenly said to me, "I have a beating heart inside me, which can be stabbed or shot, but I have no heart which can feel love, compassion, or tenderness." She spoke to me in a very cold voice. It was cold and empty sounding, like the rooms in Miss Havisham's house. But when I looked into her face, I saw something familiar about her in another person I had seen. I tried to think where, but I could not. After my visit to Miss Havisham's house, I left to return to London immediately. I did not visit Joe. I knew I would not be able to talk to Joe like I wanted to, because my mind was filled with thoughts of Estella. Miss Havisham's words kept ringing in my ears. A few months later, I received some terrible news. My sister died, so I returned to Joe's house to find it filled with people from the village. Everyone was sad. I found Joe sitting in a chair in one corner, looking very grim. He was dressed in black. I went over to him and asked, "Dear Joe, how are you?" He looked up and said, "Oh, Pip, it's good to see you. I'm so glad you came. Do you remember when she was full of energy and youth?" Then he wept in that cold, empty corner of the room. Later, Joe, I, and the rest of the village went to the graveyard to bury my sister next to my mother and father, and to say farewell to her. Even though it was a very sad day, the birds sang in the trees, and a very light breeze blew to lighten our heavy hearts. After my sister's funeral, I returned to London. My life continued on, and finally, my 21st birthday came. Like I had expected, Mr. Jaggers came to tell me that my yearly income would be much larger now. I had also expected to find out who my benefactor was. However, Mr. Jaggers didn't tell me, and so I asked, "I would like to know who very kindly gives me all this money." Mr. Jaggers replied, "You will find out when your benefactor wants you to know." I was very confused. I was absolutely sure that it was Miss Havisham, and I couldn't understand why she didn't want me to know. Even though Mr. Jaggers came with good news that day, he also had some bad news. He told me that Drummle was courting Estella. I was completely taken aback and left to visit Miss Havisham the next day. I arrived quite early in the day, and when I entered the house, I found Miss Havisham sitting next to a fire. Estella was sitting on a stool doing some knitting. When I saw her, she was obviously upset. She threw her knitting to one side and stood up impatiently. This bothered Miss Havisham, who cried, "What are you doing? Are you sick of me?" Estella answered in a dim voice, "I am just tired of myself." "Tell me the truth. I know you are tired of me," demanded the old woman. Estella did not reply, and this made Miss Havisham even angrier. "You are so cold. You have a stone for a heart." This surprised Estella, who replied, "What? You think I'm cold?" "Why, Estella, you are," Miss Havisham told her. Every time I had seen them together, they had been very calm. It surprised me very much to see them arguing. Estella now replied, "Well, if I am cold, it's because you made me that way. You can take all the blame for it." Miss Havisham was quite upset, and she said to me, "Pip, she is so proud, isn't she? Didn't I give her all the love I could?" "Well, who taught me to be cold and hard?" Estella snapped. "It is your fault." "But I didn't teach you to be this way to me," the old woman said sadly. She put her arms out, wanting Estella to come to her. "You taught me that love is an enemy," Estella said quietly. The two women said nothing to each other for a few moments. It seemed like the argument was over. Miss Havisham sat in her chair, looking very sad, and Estella stood by the fire. Estella went back to her stool, sat down and picked up her knitting. Now that everything had calmed between the two, I thought that it was my best opportunity to ask Estella about Drummle. "Why are you spending time with Drummle? He is selfish, lazy, stupid, and has a bad temper. You deserve better than that," I asked her. She did not look at me when she replied. "Moths and many ugly insects fly to the light of a candle. Is the candle to blame?" "No, but you can help it," I said. She stopped knitting and looked into the fire. I sat down to look into her face. It was my chance to tell her how I felt. "Estella, I love you. I have always loved you since the first time I saw you," I told her. "I know that you will never love me or want to be with me, but I love you anyway. Your words mean nothing to me. I told you that I have no heart that can feel love. I warned you about this once." She was right. "I am spending time with Bentley Drummle. He will be here tonight to have dinner with us," she told me. I asked her, "Yes, but do you love him? Are you going to marry him?" I greatly feared Estella's answer. I knew that if she married Drummle, she would regret it for the rest of her life. "I told you before that I cannot love, but I will marry him," she said. I felt my life had just been shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Estella, please don't marry him," I begged her. "Miss Havisham only taught you that love is the enemy because her own heart was broken. She only wanted revenge. You will be so unhappy with Drummle." "I will marry him whether you like it or not. It has nothing to do with you or my adoptive mother. It is my decision and my mistake to make," Estella said. I felt very angry and I shouted, "Drummle is an idiot. He doesn't deserve you." Estella took my hand and said, "We will never understand each other, but at least let's try to be friends." I took her hand and pressed my lips to it. My tears rolled down my cheeks and onto her beautiful soft white skin. Chapter 5. My Benefactor. Time seemed to go by very quickly. Before I knew it, I was 23 years old. I was not living with Herbert's father anymore. Instead, Herbert and I had moved into a place called Garden Court, which was by the river. Over the past few days, there had been some terrible weather in London. It had rained constantly, and because of this, I had stayed indoors the whole time. I was feeling very depressed. Herbert was in France on business, and I missed his cheerfulness. That evening, I was in my room doing some reading. Suddenly, I heard the sound of footsteps. I took my lamp out into the hallway and called out, "Is anyone there?" "Yes," said a voice. "Who are you looking for?" I asked. The voice said, "Mr. Pip." "I am Mr. Pip," I replied. A man slowly walked up the stairs. He was about 60 years old, and he was dressed like a seaman. "What do you want?" I asked him. "I will tell you," he said. We went into my room and he took off his coat. He put out both his hands for me to take. Since I did not recognize him, I was worried that he was crazy. "I have waited so long for this day. Please give me a moment," he said. He sat down and looked around nervously. "Is there anyone with you tonight?" he asked. "Excuse me," I said, "but you are a stranger here. You have no right to ask that." The man laughed and said, You are quite bold. I am glad you grew up to be bold." Just then, I recognized the man. He was the man I had met in the graveyard many years ago. He was the escaped prisoner. I didn't know what to say. He put his hands out again, and not knowing what to do, I put my hands in his. He continued, "I have always been grateful for how you helped me that day in the graveyard." I pulled away from him. "I don't need you to thank me for that. I just hope that you are a changed man," I said harshly to him. He looked hurt, so I said more kindly, "You must stay and have a drink before you go. You are tired and wet." I gave him something warm to drink, and then he told me about what had happened to him. He escaped from the prison one more time and made his way to Australia. There he became a sheep farmer and made a lot of money. "I see you have done well in life too," he said. "Tell me your story." "Well, I have a benefactor," I stuttered. "Really? Does your yearly income begin with the number 5 by any chance?" he asked me. I was very surprised because my income was £500. How could he know that? I thought. Then he asked me, "You had a guardian before you turned 21, didn't you? His name begins with a J, doesn't it? Is his name Jaggers?" I was horrified. I knew the truth now. This man was my benefactor, and not Miss Havisham, like I first thought. The prisoner saw how shocked I was. "Yes, Pip, I made you a gentleman. After what you did for me, I promised myself that I would work hard so that you could live well," he said. I stepped back from him. I felt terrible that such a man had paid for the life I had been living. I was quite depressed. My great expectations were dust. Miss Havisham wasn't my benefactor. I had hoped so much that Miss Havisham wanted me to marry Estella. It was all a dream. Then I thought of Joe. Poor Joe. I deserted wonderful, kind-hearted Joe for a criminal. The man took my hands again, and as he did so, I felt my heart pound in my chest. "I must sleep somewhere tonight. I have been at sea for months and months," he told me. Even though I did not want the man to stay in my house, I allowed him to sleep in Herbert's room. The next morning, we ate breakfast together, and he told me that his name was Abel Magwitch. He ate breakfast quickly, and as soon as he had finished, he stood up and put a wallet on the table. It was full of money. "It's for you, Pip," he said. "I want you to buy the best of everything and be a real gentleman." "No," I shouted. "I don't want your money. It's not mine. All I want to know is if the police are looking for you. I hope you won't be staying long. You are only visiting for a short while, aren't you?" "No, I will be in England for good," he said. "I can change my appearance, but if the police catch me, they will hang me. You have to find a place for me to live." I didn't know what to do, so Magwitch hid in my room. A few days later, Herbert came back from France. I had to tell him. Magwitch made Herbert hold a Bible and said, "Swear you won't tell anyone that you saw me." I felt awful. After all of Herbert's kindness to me, I didn't want to force him to keep this secret. Later that day, when I was alone with Herbert, he said, "He can't stay here. He has to leave England and he won't go without you." Herbert was right. I would never be free if Magwitch stayed in England. I decided never to take any money, but after he had given so much to me, I hated the thought of the police catching him. He continued to stay in our apartment and only went out at night for some fresh air. Not long after, the guard warned me that he had seen a stranger outside of our place. The man had a long scar and wore old, torn clothes. The guard said he seemed to be looking up at our windows. He must be after Magwitch, I thought. The next morning I asked, "Do you know a man with a long scar on his face?" The guard said a man with a scar has been watching our place. "I know who he is. His name is Compayson. He used to be a gentleman, but he was also a thief." He continued, "I met him a long time ago, and I became his partner. Together, we planned to cheat people out of money in the horse races. He had the ideas, and I did the dirty work. We were eventually caught, and he, looking like a gentleman, said I was the guilty one. He was sent to prison for only 7 years, whereas I got 14 years. I promised to get revenge one day." I looked at Magwitch. I could see the anger in his eyes. Eventually, We both escaped from the prison on the same night. We found each other in a field and fought. That was around the time when you and I met in the graveyard, he said. There was silence between us for a few moments, and then he said, I heard you know Miss Havisham, is that right? Yes, I answered. Then you would be interested to know that Compeyson was a friend of Miss Havisham's half-brother. He was the man who pretended to love her and then deserted her on her wedding day, Magwitch informed me. The pieces of this strange puzzle were starting to fit together. Herbert and I had to get Magwitch away from Compeyson. In a week, we moved him to another place right on the river. He stayed at Herbert's girlfriend's house at Millpond Bank. Magwitch and I planned to catch a steamboat to leave England. I didn't know exactly when the safest time would be to get Magwitch onto the boat, so I rode past the house every evening. I was waiting for a sign from Herbert. One day, I received a message from Mr. Jaggers. He wanted me to join him for dinner. I went and heard that there was a message from Miss Havisham. She would like you to visit her. She also wants you to know that Estella and Drummle are married, Mr. Jaggers told me. I was completely taken by surprise. I had forgotten all about Estella since the arrival of Magwitch. As I sat there, thinking about Estella and Drummle, the housekeeper brought out the dinner. Each time she served a dish, I kept thinking to myself, who does she remind me of? Then I realized that she looked just like Estella. Could she be Estella's real mother? For the rest of the evening, I could think of nothing else. The next morning, I set out to visit Miss Havisham. When I arrived, the house was in terrible condition, but the worst thing was that Estella was gone. I saw Miss Havisham sitting in the banquet room. She looked so lonely. Who is it? She asked. It is Pip, I answered. I sat down next to her. She started to speak. My heart is not made of stone. If I could change Estella, I would. I regret raising her to be so cold. If you can forgive me, please do so, she begged. I have already forgiven you, I said. I have caused hurt to others too, you know. Then I asked her, whose child is Estella? Miss Havisham shook her head. Mr. Jaggers brought her to you, didn't he? Yes, when she was about 2 or 3. Her real mother was accused of murder. Jaggers was her lawyer. He didn't tell me anything else about her mother. Evening came, and it was time for me to leave. In the courtyard, I turned to take a last look at the old house. Flames were coming out of the window of the banquet room. I ran into the house. Miss Havisham's old dress had caught on fire. The fire continued, and I pulled the tablecloth off the table and wrapped her in it. She screamed in pain. At last the fire was out, and I looked at my hands. They had also been burned by the fire. The burns were unbearable. A doctor came to take care of Miss Havisham and me. I left soon after. Chapter 6. Another New Beginning. The fire had badly burned my left arm all the way to the shoulder. My right arm was not so bad. Herbert had to change my bandages for me every day. One day, as he helped me, he said, I had an interesting conversation with Magwitch the other day. He said that he was married once. People say his wife, out of jealousy, murdered another woman. I was very excited by this. Jaggers took her case. No one saw the crime. She didn't have to go to jail, added Herbert. When? I asked him. It was about the time he met you. He also had a child about the same age as you in the graveyard, and you reminded him of his lost child. That's why he has helped you all this time. Herbert, I think Estella is Magwitch's lost child, I cried. I must find out for sure. The next day, I went to see Mr. Jaggers. You took the child to Miss Havisham, didn't you? I know who her mother is. She is the housekeeper here, I told him. Really? He replied. Then I told him Miss Havisham's and Magwitch's stories. It is true, I wanted to help a poor child who had no future. There are so many of them in this world, he said. Her father was in and out of jail, and her mother was accused of murder. I had to help the poor child. I gave the child a good home and her mother a job. It is our secret to keep, Pip. The next day, when I woke up, I had a fever. My arm was very swollen and red. It was incredibly painful. I slept for 2 days, and Herbert changed my bandages every few hours. I had to be well enough to get onto the steamboat with Magwitch on Wednesday. Startop agreed to help us row the boat to the steamer. Wednesday came and I put on a heavy coat and took one bag. We went down to the river to Mill Pond Bank, and Magwitch was waiting for us. He got into the boat and said, "Thank you for doing this. It will be wonderful to enjoy freedom again." "Soon you will be able to enjoy that freedom," I said. We rowed for a long time down the river. We waited, and at about 1:30 we finally saw the smoke of the steamer. I felt very sad as I said goodbye to Herbert. The steamer came very close, and just as we were about to call out to the captain, another boat appeared. There were 3 men in it, and one of them was a policeman. "You have the escaped prisoner, Abel Magwitch, in your boat. Arrest him," he yelled out. The boat hit ours. Then I could see Kompe-san in the other boat. Magwitch jumped at him, and the 2 men fell into the river. They fought in the water, and then both disappeared. A few moments later, I saw Magwitch swimming away, but the policeman caught him. He dragged him into the boat and handcuffed him. Magwitch was badly hurt. He had broken one of his ribs, which had injured a lung. Kompe-san was found dead. He had drowned. Magwitch was taken back to prison, and I went to see him there. He became very sick. As he had been so good to me, I could not desert him like I had deserted Joe. Later, at his court trial, he was found guilty of murdering Kompe-san. The police said that he did not drown. Now Magwitch had to spend the rest of his life in jail. One morning he asked me, "Pip, are you always the first one to arrive at the prison?" "Yes," I told him. "Our time together is too precious to waste." "Thank you for being so faithful to me." Magwitch then groaned in pain. He put his head on his pillow. "Magwitch, can you hear me?" I asked. He squeezed my hand. I said, "I know you had a child who you loved but lost. I know her and I love her. She is a beautiful, fine lady." Magwitch took my hand and pressed it to his lips. Then quietly, his head dropped onto his chest. It was over. His face looked peaceful as he died that day. After Magwitch died, I became very sick. My whole body ached, and I couldn't move. During that time, 2 men came to collect some money I owed. I didn't have any, so they said, "Then you must come with us." I said in a small voice, "I would if I could, but I might die on the way." I could not hear their reply. For the next few days, I have no memory of what happened. I dreamed of Joe, and I thought I saw him sitting on a chair in the room. It was a strange dream. One day, I awoke to see Joe reading one of my books. "Water! I need some water," I said in a weak voice. A hand gave me a glass of water. "Joe, is it really you?" I asked. "Of course it is," he said. "Joe, I don't deserve to be treated so well after I treated you so badly." "We're old friends, Pip. I would do anything for you," he said kindly. "Have you been here the whole time?" I asked. "Almost," he answered. "We heard that you were sick, so Biddy told me to come." "What about Miss Havisham?" I asked. "She died about a week after you became sick," he said. With Joe taking wonderful care of me, I quickly recovered. He even took me into the country to get some fresh air. For a long time, I had not been able to walk. But there in the country, I tried to walk a few steps. I said, "It won't be long until I am walking again." Joe replied, "Just do it slowly, all right?" A few days later, Joe asked me, "Are you feeling stronger now?" "Yes, every day I am becoming stronger," I said. But the next morning when I woke up, Joe had left. He left me a note that said I was well enough to live my life as a gentleman again, and he did not want to be a bother to me. With a note was a receipt for my bills. He had paid everything for me. I had to go to his home and thank him. I had also thought about Biddy a lot. I planned to ask her to marry me, and I hoped that she would be able to see that I had changed. 3 days later, I went to visit Joe. I went into his workroom, but everything was closed. I went and looked through the windows of the house. There were flowers everywhere. I went inside and found Joe sitting beside Biddy. They were dressed in their best clothes. Biddy saw me and cried, "Pip, today is our wedding day." I was very happy I had not told Joe about my plans for Biddy. They were both so excited to see me. I could not spoil their happiness. "Biddy, you have the best husband in the world, and Joe, you have the best wife in the world," I congratulated them. Then I said, "I will leave England today. I owe you my life, and I am going to repay all of the money you used to pay my bills. I wish you all the best. I hope you have a child, and please tell him that I love you both. I know he will be a better man than I." I left them and went to join Herbert's company. I worked hard, and I became a partner. Herbert eventually married Clara, and we all lived very happily together. 11 years later, I returned to visit Joe and Biddy. I arrived at their home and looked in through the window. Biddy was beside the fire doing some knitting and Joe was smoking his pipe. I saw a small boy sitting on one of the kitchen chairs. They were so happy to see me. "This is our son Pip," they told me. "We named him after you." I stayed with them for a few days, and one evening Biddy asked, "Pip, why haven't you ever married?" "Well, I guess I am so comfortable living with Herbert and Clara," I answered. Then Biddy asked, "Do you think of her often?" Biddy knew my heart very well, but I just said, "That part of my life is over." I discovered that Estella's marriage had ended. She had been very unhappy, and Drummle was eventually killed by a horse he had been beating. I walked over to visit Miss Havisham's old house. Everything was gone, except for the old rocks for the garden wall. A gate was still there, and I pushed it. I walked around the old garden, and thought of the many times I had been there before. Suddenly, in the distance, I saw someone. "Estella!" I cried. She came and I saw that she had changed. "I have changed a lot, haven't I?" she asked. She had a new beauty that was filled with warmth and softness. We found a bench and sat down. "We met in this same place a long time ago. Seems strange, doesn't it?" I said. "I feel sorry for this old place. I've had to sell everything little by little." "Are you still living abroad?" she asked. "Yes, I am." "And you are very successful?" she asked again. "Yes, and I work very hard," I replied. "I often think about what I threw away with you, but I am a much better person now. I understand what is valuable in life. Please tell me I have not lost you as a friend," she said. "You have always had a special place in my heart," I told her. Estella smiled, and I took her hand in mine. We left that place together, but we never left each other again.